So there's a lot of talk about a big potential welterweight matchup for Shavkat Rakhmonov, and it looks like his next opponent will be Colby Covington. And that's probably going to take place in June, which matches up with Shavkat's injury recovery. You know, we know after his last fight, he needed to take a few months and have a surgery, and then he'd likely be back sometime in the late spring, early summer. So a couple of things to unpack here. One, this matchup to me seems like a nightmare matchup for Colby Covington because Colby is so wrestling heavy and he's able to pin his opponents down and win rounds and win minutes. And that's typically how he wins most of his fights. That is off the table with Shavkat Rakhmonov. But the bigger picture that I want to talk about here, because this piece of matchmaking certainly feels to me like the UFC is now ready to transition Colby Covington into the next phase of his career, which is away from being a potential title holder, a number one contender, or somebody who they have that's climbing the ranks, all the way to somebody who they're now ready to start building the stars off of tomorrow on. Yeah. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, as much as I hate to admit it, the writing's kind of on the wall for this one. And Colby Covington is likely never going to find himself in another title fight. Maybe a BMF if it somehow winds its way back around. But ultimately, Colby Covington's days of becoming a UFC champion are now over, and he's going to have to, basically hand his hand out to the next generation, and they're going to have a hard time getting him out of there. But I do think ultimately his job now is to be either a gatekeeper or a stepping stone for the next generation to get over. And look, Shavkat Rakhmonov is the Khamzat Chimaev of the world that people just don't quite know about yet.
Yeah.
They're learning, but they still don't know him yet. And I believe Shavkat is honestly one of the most high-skilled, best fighters, not only in welterweight, but in the entire UFC. I mean, to have a perfect finishing record and almost basically perfectly even between submissions and knockouts is insane. And to continue that same sort of streak and finishing streak outside of the UFC and inside of the UFC is wildly impressive. Most of the times, if you get these guys who come up from out of the UFC and they've got a ton of great finishes, and then they get to the UFC and then they're just going to decision and they're not really able to have those sort of finishing ways that they had on their way to the UFC. That's not the case for Shavkat. He's getting everybody out of there in the duration of the fight. And this one would have to be a 25-minute fight, especially if it's going to be, a main event for a fight night or something like that. That's priming Shavkat for the 5-round fights, for the championship fights that are inevitable for him. They know he's well on his way to a title shot. And ultimately, I feel like this is just the right next test for Shavkat. If he's able to go in there and beat Colby Covington within the 25 minutes that he's allotted, I think we've got a real number one contender on our hands and somebody that solidified themselves as the next up for the title shot at 170. Colby Covington is still absolutely one of the best fighters on the planet, but if you watched his last performance, you were a little bit underwhelmed, and recency bias gets us all. I would love to see Colby Covington have one of those y'all must have forgot type of situations and go out there and shock the world and beat somebody like Shavkat. But in my opinion, at his age and after the way we saw him fight in his last fight, his title shot, the biggest opportunity in his career, for him to go out that way, I was like, you know what? The best days of Colby Covington's career are behind him, and now it's time to pass the torch. Shavkat Rakhmonov has champion written all over him.
Yeah, I think this primes him for a title shot if he gets Colby out of there, especially if he defeats him within the 25 minutes. And it's not, this could be Shavkat's first decision victory, although my early prediction will be that it is not. I think he will continue that unbeaten streak, but not just unbeaten, also with 100% finish rate.
Yeah, if he gets everybody out there in 15, if you give him 10 more minutes to work, he's going to be able to do it.
Right, and Colby Covington's style is to beat you by decision. He grinds you out with the wrestling, and then he beats you by decision. So it's the worst possible kind of matchup for him. Somebody who can match or better his wrestling, who also has lethal KO power and great submissions, because one thing we know about Colby is his wrestling is superb, but he's not a submission guy. Right. So he's actually susceptible to the submission, in my opinion. And I said that against Leon when he was fighting Leon Edwards. I said, if anybody gets a submission in this fight, I actually predict Leon to get it. And I took a bunch of flack for that, but I stand by that. I think Leon had the better chance of submitting Colby. Now, Colby had the better chance of keeping top position and all that, but we saw how good the champion actually is, which if Shavkat's able to defeat Colby Covington, which I'm going to say early on that he is, that sets up an incredible fight between Leon and Shavkat, presuming that Leon is still the champion. He's likely going to take on Belal Muhammad sometime in the spring, which will set up for a big
End of the year,
Yeah, it was set up for a big title fight towards the end of the year, maybe out in Abu Dhabi, maybe Madison Square Garden, November, something of that nature. And listen, Colby Covington, he has been criticized for not having a strength of schedule. And while I do subscribe to the fact that there are welterweights that have had a way tougher road to the top than Colby, taking on Shavkat Rakhmonov is about the toughest hand that you can be dealt. So if Colby's able to somehow shock us all and defeat this rising star, then, who knows? Maybe they throw him back in there.
Then you have to put him back in the title contention, even though he's a little bit older and he's had his couple of shots, and the last one wasn't all that impressive. Shavkat is as advertised. You're going to get one of the best high-level strikers and high-level grapplers on the planet every time he goes out there, because in my opinion, MMA is always progressing at a crazy rate, and you get these guys who are bringing new techniques into the world of MMA, and Shavkat's one of them. He's kind of, even though he does everything really well and he kind of sticks to his fundamentals for the most part, or at least that's what the eyes tell you, he's doing all sorts of interesting stuff, both on the feet and up against the cage and on the ground. He's just very crafty, very creative, and he's part of the evolution of the current MMA landscape. I really think that guys like him, guys like Khamzat Chimaev, are pushing the game even further. And unfortunately for the older folks in the divisions like the Colby Covingtons, it's just hard to adapt. They've already spent, the last, decade or even longer for some of them, fine-tuning their skills and what worked at that time for MMA. But the game is evolving, and now these young guys that learned all their moves when they were teenagers are now on their way up. Now they're becoming their opponents, and it's becoming very difficult to match their new skills, match your old skills, and then also keep that athletic energy of a young person. Shavkat Rakhmonov is very young, and I will say one thing. I saw him in person. He's massive.
Yeah.
I've never personally met Colby Covington or seen him, but I can only imagine, because what people say, he only gets up to about 181 or something like that he's going to be wildly undersized if he fights Shavkat, because Shavkat, I think he's like 6'2".
Yeah,
and
he's a big boy.
He looked damn near 200 pounds when I saw him, and that was on fight week. So he's a big guy, and he's very powerful, and he doesn't have a hard time making the weight cut, which is really, really scary when you have somebody
speaks to his discipline.
Exactly. So I think Colby Covington is going to have his hands full if he has this fight, but this is sort of the nature of the business. It's the nature of the UFC. You get your shot, and as soon as you show us that you aren't really capable of being a number one contender or a champion anymore, you got to make your way back down the rankings, and unfortunately, that means you become a stepping stone for the next generation. Shavkat is 100% the next generation.
Well, as Colby's mentor, Chael Sonnen, likes to say, the sport is always done with you before you're done with the sport, and the only way out is face down and embarrassed. So this could be the beginning of that unfortunate end for Colby Covington.